So I read a good book at the dog park today. It's called Felon. It's by Reginald Dwayne Betts. I had heard a fair amount about Betts and had read a little bit of his prose, but had never really read much of his poems. So I got this one at the bookstore recently, and it's good. It includes one of the few guzzles I've ever liked. I really fucking hate the guzzle as a form. I just find it like very monotonous and self-indulgent. I mean, granted, it's a poem in which the same phrase or word at least necessarily repeats every two lines, and then it ends with an invocation of the poet's own name. So there's some degree of the monotony and self-indulgence that's baked into the form. But I don't tend to like guzzles. This one I quite liked, and I'm going to read it at some point on the show later on. But I thought it was a good book. I thought it had a handful of really, really strong poems and a lot throughout that was just stirring and thought provocative and phrased in ways that made me think a little bit differently about language. Not enormously. I was on a text thread with Alice and Cameron this morning and as well, and Cameron went on again about his mad prisms of language that he loves. I'm not as big a lover of mad prisms of language. This is not a book with a lot of mad prisms of language, though it is a book in which there's a fair amount of pretty skillful meter and rhyme deployed very quietly. I had not known Betts was much of a formal poet, but at any rate, I'm glad to know about him. I'm glad to read some poems of his, and I have heard he's a very interesting thinker and talker. So at some point I would love to have him on the show. A thought that did occur to me, apart from the quality of the book itself, which was, as I said, good. And it's a nice looking book too. It's well designed. There were a number of grammatical errors in it. Not a lot, maybe 3 or 4 that I noticed. Now, much of the book is written in a vernacular English in which, in keeping with the conventions of Black American speech, the verb to be is often dropped, as well as the possessive s. So there's there's a lot of book that's written in the way that people talk, not necessarily the way that one is used to seeing words put down in print. And that's fine. I don't consider that an error at all. But there were also, like subject verb agreement errors here's an example that I think is probably not deliberate. The accumulation of our yesterdays hang like the last dusk before us. Now, if yesterday's was the subject, then hang would be conjugated correctly. But the subject is actually accumulation. So that, I'm pretty sure, is an error. It's also an extremely common error that people make, particularly because accumulation appears on the line before. So not a big deal at all. Certainly not a major fault in Betts' work. But I do count it as sort of a strike against the editor. Because in addition to a handful of grammatical errors, I thought it was a book that could have done with some trimming. It could have done with a thoughtful editorial hand to say, this is, this lags a little bit. You use the word redact twice in the opening guzzle. It's a fairly uncommon word. Granted, it's one that Betts employs in a larger project that he's working on, but not in that poem. It's just a verb that he's gotten used to using a little more than one might normally. And that, was those two stanzas, along with maybe 1 or 2 others, were sort of soft spots in the guzzle. It was a book where I thought you could have done with somebody to just play the slightest bit of devil's advocate or tug of war with the author, which is generally how books, plays, movies get better, by having somebody who is not the primary author saying, what if we press here a little bit? What if we pull back here a little bit? I had an excellent editor for my first book, Alex Pepple, who questioned me on very small matters of diction, as well as larger. issues of clarity, and even, asked me to find a few more poems to include for the sake of making the volume thick enough for the spine to support text, because I had such a stripped down collection that they were afraid they were going to have to put it together with a staple. So he spent quite a good deal of time with me on that collection. And I thought it struck a good balance of putting pressure on me, questioning some of my decisions, nitpicking, really looking out for errors, but also nitpicking moments of carelessness, moments of self-indulgence. And he also let me have the final say in most cases. So I don't know who edited this book. I tried to look it up and I wasn't able to find it listed anywhere, obviously. And I don't know what conversations might have occurred, but I have a guess. Because I have found that Alex, great man that he is not the rule when it comes to books of poetry. Particularly with the big presses. Now, I know that a couple of regular listeners to the show, at least, we'll say, of the people who listen to the show and let me know that they listen, I know at least a couple of them are published by major, big five publishers. And so they may have good insights into what the editors do for them. But this is not the first book published by a major press. This was published by Norton that contained just some sort of inexcusable errors, as well as some obvious excesses. Just some things that any thoughtful editor, any thoughtful reader should say, well, this should go, right? Not because these poets, or these, not in all cases poets, in many cases poets. This is not because these writers are bad, but because every writer needs somebody to ride them a little bit, to pull against them a little bit, to bring them to their best. And I suspect, I was talking with Alice recently about an episode we're planning about masculinity and femininity, and it was occurring to me that I'm going to have to define the term fighting words. So I'll define it later, but for future reference, Alice, here's an example of fighting words. I think that most editors of most poetry books, especially the big ones, especially at the most popular ones, the biggest presses, the ones that actually sell a lot of copies, I'm fairly confident that apart from selecting the poets, in many cases based not necessarily on the quality of the poetry, but on the appeal of the name, the appeal of the persona, the reputation, the platform, etc. Apart from making the selection and overseeing the physical construction of the book, when it comes to the text of the poetry collections, I strongly suspect that the vast majority of poetry book editors do fuck all. Nothing. Don't touch the words, don't look at the words, and in many cases, don't give a shit about the words. Not because they are not good, not because they are not worth giving a shit about, but because that is the role of the poetry book editor. And I'll pull back. At smaller presses, I think the editors give a shit. At the big five, I'm guessing Shane is already composing an email telling me that his editor gives a shit and is a wonderful person and he has a good relationship. And I believe that. I am suspicious of the category. I've read too many books of poetry that clearly weren't edited by anybody. So there are my fighting words for the day. I await your righteous indignation. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening. And thanks especially to David Clark who is at the Sewanee Writers Conference right now with my wife, and who apparently in a little session that he did today brought up the podcast, told a couple people about it. So thank you, David. I know lots of the rest of you have also recommended the podcast to a friend or to a class or to a family member or whoever, and I am grateful for that. Word of mouth is really what makes the difference. So thank you all very much. If you have not yet taken advantage of the my little summer promotion, go to sleeverickets.substack.com and sign up for a free trial. All you have to do is list your email address. You're only giving it to me. I don't send out a bunch of email. If you put it in, I will give you a free week's trial of The Secret Show. You can go on, you can download all 9 episodes that are on there now, as well as any that come out in the next week, which I think will be 1. I've been doing like maybe 3 a month. It's sometimes maybe 4. We'll see how it goes. Probably not quite every week, but in addition to the main feed, you get all of the episodes that are already there, as well as aiming for maybe three new ones a month is about it. I think 3, maybe 4. We'll see. But there are some really fun ones up there now. I put one out just Friday, I think. So please go to sleeverickets.substack.com and sign up for a free trial now. All you got to do is sign up for the free subscription, and I will take care of the rest. And I've written some emails. I've had a correspondence with a couple of you. If you have signed up for a free subscription and you're having trouble with the Secret Show link, let me know. Write to sleeverickets@gmail.com. I think sleeverickets@substack.com also works, but I think that works, and it should forward to my main email account, but I'm not sure yet. If you want to give it a try, I would appreciate that, just to help me get my fucking bearings as somebody who's not all that fluent in internet technology. So thanks for all of that. And the TeePublic lady asked me to tell you all that there's a big sale, and the t-shirts are substantially cheaper than they usually are. And if you are a Secret Show subscriber, you have a special top secret, unguessable, hacker-proof code you can enter to get an even bigger discount. So I'll put a link in the show notes to that. Sleeve Rickets t-shirts are TeePublic. People have been buying a fair number of them recently, and they come in just about any color you can think of, and a few different styles of t-shirts for those of you who are into different styles of t-shirts. I know if nothing else, they have t-shirts for ladies and gentlemen, which you should feel free to mix and match. All right, I had planned to put out an episode that was all about email, listener email this week, and specifically email and Twitter and text messages in response to the rabbit hole. But then the big recording I did of the first part of that episode got fucked up. And it's been a long week. I'm solo with my 4-year-old this week while my wife is at Sewanee and our other daughter is at summer camp. So it's just Ellie and Echo and me, and I'm worn the fuck out. So instead, this week, I'm going to give you a really fun conversation I was saving up a little bit that is not at all what was planned. It came out a lot weirder and more personal than I'd expected. Initially, it was sort of about an Atlantic article on fantasy football, which I have no interest in, but it turned out to be a good deal juicier than I thought. And then we also talked about a depression and friendship and a very sad and very funny short story. So I'll just let the episode speak for itself. I think you will enjoy it. I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed editing it as well. So I'll give you that, and then at my dad's request, he said I saw him recently, and he said I should go back to putting a poem at the end of every episode that sums everything up in a really tidy way. And I told him finding a poem that sums everything up in some random fucking episode is really hard to do, but I will at least do it this week because I have a poem I've been wanting to share, and I think it actually suits at least the latter half of this conversation pretty fucking well. So I will get to that at the end. Thanks, and here's my conversation with Brian. One thing I'm curious about, because I wonder how much the algorithm is sussing out my interest, because I would never voluntarily like, oh, I'd like to read this article about fantasy sports, but the perhaps deceptive, I mean, sort of deceptive, still sort of accurate title that they gave me was "Can Men Be Friends?" And so I clicked on that, and it turned out to be, yeah, sorry.
The title I got was "The Age of Fantasy Sports." Period.
Which seems like those seem like there's very little potential overlap between those titles, right? Like there ends up being in this article, but like that's a pretty big range of possible article that could be when you click on it.
But before we get to it, do you have any questions about fantasy sports? Because he doesn't really define fantasy sports. He doesn't really say what role it played in his life. He assumes that we have a bad attitude towards it and sort of defends it before he abandons fantasy sports. But just before we get to the article itself, I imagine, although the statistics, suggest that like 99% of men in America between the age of 15 and 35 play fantasy sports, I imagine the Slee Ricketts audience might
be a slightly
have
lower
a disproportionate sense of that 1%. Yeah. So is there anything that you need me to describe or explain about fantasy sports, or is it relatively straightforward?
Can I give you my brief understanding of what it is and how it works, and you can correct it?
Yes, of course.
All right. So there are professional sports leagues where people play games with each other at a very high level. And then there are people who are fans of this. And then some of these people put together leagues in which the rules work out to be that at the beginning of the season, they take turns, as in a professional draft, picking up all of the players from the league that they want to have.
If you're a simpleton, you do a draft. Otherwise, you do an auction. So the typical way to get players is for what you described, which is a draft, where if you have 10 or 12 people in a room or over a Skype call, you take turns. So you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then the 10th gets 2 picks to make it fair. And then it goes 9, 8, 7, 6 up to 1. Then 1 gets 2 picks. That's called a snake draft. Okay. And you take turns selecting the player you want the most at the time. The more sophisticated way to do it is you all start with $200, and then you name a player and you bid for the player against one another. So that way, as opposed to waiting until it's your turn to make a pick, theoretically, every pick is in play, and you can decide whether you want to bid $42 for the running back or 43. Right. Obviously, if you bid 44, then you have less money for the other players, and it's more calculation. But yes. Yeah. In the beginning, correlating with the beginning of each season, you either through a draft or an auction divvy up the best players among what are usually 10 or 12, but sometimes can be 14 teams. And then within the regular season, my team will play your team, for example, and then my team will play Joanna's team, and then my team will play Alex's team. And while I'm doing that, your team will play Joanna's team, and Joanna will play Alice's team for as many weeks as there is the regular season. And then based on whoever has the best record in those head-to-head competitions, there's a playoff system.
But you skipped like a big confusing part for me.
Like how the scoring works.
How the scoring works, because the players on the Brian team are in reality on lots of different teams, all playing in different combinations.
So by far the most commonly played fantasy sport is fantasy football, because there's only one game a week, where you really have to be a maniac to play fantasy baseball. Because for play fantasy baseball, there are every team most days, and if you're doing it correctly, you have to follow every single.
Sorry, you skipped a little bit, so just clarify. In baseball, what happens?
In baseball, every team plays most days, so there are 162 baseball games in a season. There are only 17 football games. So most sane fantasy sports players, insofar as that can be, play fantasy football because they really only need attention to 16 or 17 weeks, 17 games, and each one takes place on Thursday through Sunday of each week. So it's just, there's a lot less to follow. Whereas for basketball, and then much more so for baseball, you need to be following hundreds and hundreds of players in dozens of games every single day.
Yeah.
So my team, for example, might have the quarterback from the Jets and the running back from the Giants and another running back from the Steelers and 2 wide receivers from the Buccaneers and the Bears. And then those individuals, based on how they perform each week, I get points. So, for example, for a running back, for each 10 yards he runs, I will get 1 point. For every fumble he loses, I will lose 2 points. For each touchdown he scores, I will get 6 points. For every time he catches a ball, I will get 1 point. And then if I add up all the points accrued by my quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, tight end, defense, and kicker, I will have something like 127 points. Whereas you, adding up all the points accrued by your quarterback and tight ends and running backs and receivers, might have 103 points, and I will win that week's game. So my score, I'll be then 1-0, you'll be 0-1, and at the end of the season, maybe I'll be 14-2. So then I'll make the playoffs and play in a single elimination round against the 3 other teams that made the playoffs.
Okay.
What this article gets right is there's a performed masculinity to this that really is irrelevant to the proceedings otherwise, that allows people such as myself, who normally would be disgusted or appalled by that sort of cavorting, to do it with an ironic detachment. But also, it's like the first time somebody wrote somebody's name on the cup, for the winner, they spelled it wrong. So then, like, every year we purposefully misspell the people's names now, and we try to do so in humorous, whimsical ways. And like what the story got right is it creates its own ecosystem full of inside jokes and an opportunity to sort of flex verbal dexterity in like very cruel, funny ways about things that we know aren't important. Like if we say like you only wanted to marry your wife because she used to be pretty and someone you wanted to sleep with, but now she's fat and you hate her, like, but you can't get divorced, what the community will think about you. Like, there's no joy in that. Like no one's gonna go like, oh, right.
You can't enjoy that vicariously.
Right. There's nothing like fun about that. But if you say like, oh, look who picked the wife beater back again this year, Azarva. Like, we all know that Azarva, like, has tendencies. So like, it's funny that he happened to pick, or maybe not coincidentally picked, the guy who was accused of beating his wife in the offseason, and now is very good at football. So there's a way to, again, like, perform masculine heteronormative behavior in a slightly detached, slightly ironic, but sincerely funny way that I'm sure, Trump voting MAGAites do in a not dissimilar way to Brooklyn urban intellectuals.
And it reminds me a little bit of the way some guys I knew back home would playfully tease and mock each other in the manner of what they imagined like homosexual people to be.
Right, and it's totally having your cake and eating it too. I mean, it's the Madison Cawthorn video that came out. This is the guy who is a Republican congressman who seems
was, like,
to hate gay people
with his
and like took off all his clothes and got into bed with his cousin and like rolled around and pretended to have sex with him. And like the difference between pretending to have sex with your cousin, rolling around naked, and having sex with your male cousin, rolling around naked, is like very much in the eye of the beholder, but it's that he was enjoying the rolling around naked as he was enjoying mocking the idea that he would roll around naked,
and mocking the idea that he would enjoy it.
Right, exactly. So, but he got to enjoy it while enjoying the mockery. Right. I think it's the same thing here. Yeah. It's like, what if we were all professional athletes? Like,
what if we were the kind of guys who would make like this joke?
Assholes
that I'm
who would make
now.
This joke, but we also get to enjoy the joke. I am interested in this idea of friendship as a significant part of life that needs to be maintained, or because that seems like the implication that he is struggling, because he says all his time is essentially spent with work and family. Jennifer Senior, in her article on friendship, said something similar, where there's the friendship gathering years and then there's the friendship enjoying years, or something like that. The implication of which, maybe I'm getting slightly wrong, but is that you don't have as much time to gather new friendships when you're more settled in your professional and familial life. But could it just be that a professional life might matter to a person and take up a lot of that person's time, and a familial life might matter to a person to take up that person's time, in a way that friends mattered more in high school, college, grad school because the lack of a family. Like I
I think that totally makes sense. But I think that can be true, and then what can also be true is in the way that like lots of high school and even in some cases college athletes, they're get into like really terrible, almost like exaggeratedly bad shape when they are out of school because exercise was something that they just breathed in like oxygen when they were in school, and then when they got out of it, they didn't then take extra efforts to maintain it. I think like it can also be true that like friendship does something really important for you, and when it becomes something that you have to go out of your way to do, most people just don't do it. And then you like even if that's largely because you are consciously more concerned with your family life or with your professional life, you're still not getting something that it would be good for you to get because it used to be something you could do more or less effortlessly.
So the author discusses a friend of his who isn't part of the basketball league. I don't think we get a name for that friend, but that friend lost his job at a restaurant during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And he writes the following about him. He immersed himself in a new diet and workout routine, which he cataloged in detail on Instagram. Other than that, the closest I got to a full view of how he was doing were the times he tried to FaceTime me. I answered him probably twice. The main implication is that he didn't answer him more than twice was my work and family. A little bit later on, there was something more shameful and less defensible there too, an aversion to intimacy, to vulnerability that had long been the subtext of our relationship that I couldn't articulate to either of us. Later on, they stop interacting, then they begin talking again. When I tried later to explain and only partway succeeded in explaining this to my friend and committed to texting him more, we both knew it wasn't enough. And then we have this sentence that really confuses me. However, it confirmed the need to treat our friendship not as a given, but as something I owed to both of us. What is he saying there?
Oh, well, I mean, I think that's just talking about, I think he's just referring to obligations that arise with like a long-term relationship.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what he's saying about friendship. Like, because I happen to live with my closest friend. Which I haven't spoken a lot about it on this show, but I was very, very ill for a couple of years. I was essentially bedridden for a year. I was dizzy all day, every day, and I was incapacitated. And I'm heavily medicated now, and I'm able to participate in life. I have said that much. What I haven't talked about is over that course of time, my wife took a big job at Facebook, which had her traveling a lot, and my kids were 0 and 2.5 years old. And my life really was unraveling, and it was profoundly difficult. Psychologically and just logistically. And a good friend of mine moved into our house, and we have a brownstone in Bed-Stuy. We live in the unit in the middle, the duplex. And now my sister lives. We rent her the apartment on the first floor, and my closest friend Eli lives on the top floor. And that's the contours of my life for the most part. I have my 2 sons, my wife, my sister on the first floor, my closest friend upstairs, and it has a bit of a sitcom vibe to it, and I think that's reasonable. I think that there are certain friends who could use more of me, who would benefit from me checking in on them more often, who don't have a partner or a life that, a professional life that is particularly meaningful and would get meaning, not because I'm spectacular as a person, but because I am a person, and having an extra person in your life, especially, somebody with whom you used to have a very good relationship or an intense relationship, would be valuable to them. And it wasn't a formal decision, but at some point I decided, like, I've got this chronic illness. I've got the 3, 4, 5 people in my house, plus my 2 parents. And I don't have much time for others. Is that a wrong decision? Is that an immoral decision? It feels like Jen Senior and the author of this would judge me for that, but I don't know. As the parent of young children, it seems like my responsibility should be to my spouse and my young kids.
Yeah.
And I was very lucky to have a friend without a spouse and young kids who was able to come and take care of me in some way. And there's some like global reciprocity I probably owe the world or something for that. But I'm limited in my ability. And like fantasy sports is a way that I get to bullshit with friends I wouldn't normally have contact with. So like the is this a bad thing aspect of the article seems like a stretch, seems like clickbait, and I don't understand it. Fantasy sports seems like truly delightful in my mind. I get to interact with 11 people who used to be very good friends of mine. Groomsmen of my wedding, some of whom were just good friends of mine. And I get to have an excuse to bullshit with them every once in a while. And it seems like a wonderful artifice to maintain a friendship outside my immediate, familial and professional life. I guess I don't see the need to complicate it as this article does. It's like, oh, it's nice to have this little extra way to be friends with somebody. And if I had time for more friends, that would be nice too. Just like Slee Rickets is like a wonderful way for me to dive deeper into my friendship with you. And like that's great that there's like a area behind it. And like, are you monetizing our friendship through the secret show? And like, should you like mistrustful of what you're doing with the t-shirt sales? Like no, like I'm doing this not as a favor to you, but I'm doing it because I enjoy it and it deepens our friendship. And the same thing with like the fantasy sports. Like it having artifice around friendship feels totally not only okay, but like natural and normal. Like I go to work twice a week and I teach, and I have colleagues with whom I'm friends now. And if I didn't teach in the classroom next to them, I wouldn't be friends with them. Like that seems fine too. Like the is this a bad thing part seems pure magazine writing extra nonsense. And the whole concept of creating structures for different degrees of intensity of friendship feels okay also. So like my takeaway of all of this is like, fantasy football is funny, and like people's spouses matter more to them than their friends.
I do though think when he says like this is an obligation, because I think part of what I hear you objecting to is that he says that friendship and this particular effort involved is an obligation I owed him and owed myself, and that I read in that also that the friend owed him, and that this is something friends owe each other as an obligation, and that I think that's pretty true. I think at the same time that it is also totally reasonable to make choices that require you to fall short in those obligations. Like part of what
But then what does the word obligation mean? Right? Because like inherent in the obligation is that you're obliged to do it. It's to me, it's a lot less obligation and more choice. Like I am very lucky in that one of the downsides of my neurological disorder is that I can't take on as many hours of work as most people I know. So I do have a little bit extra time to check in with friends and send a bullshit email or a text or a Slee Rickets or a something, in a way that my wife, for example, doesn't. And I know that one of the things that she feels most profoundly lacking in her own life is friendship. But she works 16-hour days, and that's a choice she made. So like, is she obliged to be a better friend to people in college with whom she was really close and who still want to maintain a level of friendship with her? I don't know what the word obligation means at that point.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess like it's something that I like about at least certain versions of Christianity, as well as like Camus' approach to existentialism over some other people's, is that like it's possible for there to be lots of like, I'm trying to find another word than obligation, but like there is a theoretical good life and a virtuous life that we do that is a real, because I think like what doesn't ring true to me is that like, oh God, my friend really needs me, and it would be and like I love this person and this person is in great need, and in fact I could go do something and really make that person's life better, but also it's much more pressing for me to be here to drive my kid to school, and so I'm not going to help. Like, just because it's totally reasonable for you to drive your kid to school, and you are gonna not go help your friend, I don't think that makes that feeling of obligation disappear. I just think that it's true that, like, I think part of what I like about Christianity is that they sort of accept that, like, people are not perfectible. And like you're always gonna fall short, but that doesn't mean that you're not falling short. Like there is a.
Why do you always have to repent for not falling short?
Well, I didn't say I like everything about Christianity. I just think like that's part of. I think like it's something that I don't necessarily like about a certain stripe of secular progressivism is the like subtle suggestion that people are perfectible, and if we get the right laws and we do the right things, then we will be living the right way. I think like there is, in a weird way, in like the current
right, but that's your issue with Twitter as much as it is with secular society, right?
Well, not it's just
like
Twitter,
super
like
easy to.
Right. I mean, I think like it's in our neighborhood and in like conversations I have with people when we venture into politics. I don't mean to say that like you are bad and I am bad because we don't do everything we could do for our friends, but I think like that we make reasonable choices that involve not doing everything we could for our friends doesn't make that debt or that link or that tug disappear. It's just there, and we just have to choose in which way we will constantly fail.
But isn't it better to feel that tug, make a choice, and move forward than to feel that tug forever and feel like you're not meeting it?
Yeah. Would it be better if we were able to control our emotions rationally? Like, probably in a lot of ways, but we're not.
But you were saying something slightly different earlier. You were saying that there's a value in that tug reminding us of our fallibility at all times.
Oh, well, no. What I'm saying is actually that the worldview that says that exists is an accurate worldview. Like, it's something I like about Christianity. Like, Christianity's account of human beings in this respect, I think, is a more accurate account than like liberal Twitter's account of human beings, or like whatever else, you know.
I had a friend in college who went to my college on an athletic scholarship and was very conscious of the fact. Well, I don't even know the fact. Was conscious of his thought that everybody around him believed he wasn't academically capable of being at college with us. So he had this attitude from the beginning that everybody thinks I'm only here because I'm good at sports, and everybody thinks I'm an idiot. And it really beat the shit out of him, that feeling. And he would drink a lot most nights, to the point of blacking out, vomiting, and freshman and sophomore year, for sort of anthropological reasons, but also because he was, when sober, I thought he was a really funny, good guy, and I had an easier time hanging out with athletes than non-athletes for some reason in the beginning of college. I considered him one of my closest friends, and he would come back and he would be vomiting all over, and I would try to have a receptacle into which you would vomit, like a garbage bag or a garbage can or something, and he would try to like punch me and knee me in like the stomach and chest while I was catching his vomit, because he was totally out of control and was trying to hurt himself and hurt other people around him. And horrible. For some reason, I kept on doing it. And in retrospect, I don't really know why. It had some sense of obligation. And he started drinking a little bit less, and he became a little bit more confident, and we became less close friends. And he told me towards the end of college that I was, one of his closest friends in college. And he thanked me for being his closest friend. And that made me feel nice. And then over the next 15 years, he kept on doing like really mean stuff. And he would show up at parties, then he would be like really drunk and angry there and be mean to people. Or he would like say cruel things to my friends whom I introduced him to. And then he would apologize and say how we were really close friends. So he still once in a while calls me up for advice or for friendship, or because he's just sobered up again and needs help. And I feel that tug of like, I've been playing this role for this guy for a long time,
Right.
and I don't want to anymore. And it was when I got sick, I decided like, okay, I'm not doing this anymore. Like, I'm not.
Sure.
This isn't. I'm not. I'm not going to be there for this person. I'm not going to do. I'm not going to help his life be any better. And I stopped returning his calls, and I once in a while would text back something innocuous. And now that friendship is over, and I think I made the right decision, although that Christian tug that you're discussing, I definitely still feel, because it's sort of shitty of me to have played a role for a long time and to stop playing that role.
Yeah.
But I bring him up because that's a relatively easy situation. I don't think anybody would blame me for it, especially a simplified version as I described it. So if he is on one side of the friendship spectrum, and on the other side is my closest friend who sort of gave up a lot of his life to come and live with me and take care of me, as I have done for him in the past, and I would, get someone else to drop my kids off at school, or, leave my wife alone for a week or two if it meant taking care of him, because there really is a sort of familial almost bond with him. I think there's a spectrum with every other friend I have, and I would put them somewhere between one and the other. And that to me seems totally reasonable. And acknowledging the tug of friendship and saying, but I choose not to sacrifice at all or as much for these other friends for whom I would sacrifice in the past, doesn't seem like something I knew to be apologetic for, or that I need to really think very much about anymore. And if there's a system, fantasy football, Slee Ricketts or otherwise, that lets me interact with these people in a simpler, more straightforward way without a lot of the other emotional baggage, that seems great to me. Is my vision of friendship non-conforming to yours? Did I say anything that seems offensive or misguided?
Not really. I mean, I think the one thing I would really question in your story about your vomiting friend is that, like, that doesn't really sound like a friendship. That sounds like a service and a parasitic kind of relationship, but like it does. I mean, I think
maybe, except that being parasitic implies that I didn't benefit from it in any way, but in fact, I must have benefited from it because I extended it for years. I think that it made me feel good that I was somebody he thought of as a friend. It made me feel good to be able to take care of somebody. It made me feel good to feel like I was.
You are kind of begging the question, though, when you say, like, that I did it means it must have been self-serving, because we only do self-serving things. Like, I mean, if you were also saying, like, you did genuinely feel something that you were glad to have, or you were glad to feel in the moment, then
and he was funny, and I liked to hang out with him when he wasn't drinking and hitting me. It was a dysfunctional friendship, but it was it was a friendship.
There were also good times, as part of what you're saying, which I think you did not.
For sure. All of this was a long run up to my saying, do we owe anything to our friends in our middle age?
Yes, but that doesn't mean we will make good on that debt. Like, I think so. Here's a shorter and probably unfairly simplified story of my own. A once very good friend to Joanna and me, who had increasingly had always been very eccentric and then increasingly became mentally unstable, was institutionalized. And when we were right when our first child was a newborn, was institutionalized and had systematically alienated everybody else in her life, and in a kind of an excited, intense gesture, like, got out of her institution that she was in and said, I'm coming to Baltimore. I need someone to stay with. Can I stay with the two of you? And and Joanna said yes, and an invitation that I think I endorsed. I would have said the same thing if she'd asked me directly. And then a little bit later, wrote back and said, I actually don't think I feel okay with this. Like, and she, as she explained to me, like, this person is demonstrably unstable, has behaved in, like, violent and erratic ways with other people. We have a newborn in our little apartment. We have to put her first. And I felt very, very bad about this. And the friend was furious and immediately cut us out of her life with a very angry note. And I responded saying that I felt bad, but also that I, supported Joanna's to say, like, we were on the same page. I think I'm obviously going to side with my wife first. At the same time, I totally think that we let down our friend. I think it's sort of true that you can't really fault us for what we did. And of course, especially when it comes to your kid as a baby, that has to come first. But also, it doesn't seem accurate to say, well, we didn't let her down at all. That was that's fair. The accounts are clean. I just think both of those things are true. And it just sort of sucks because we're limited,
So did David Foster Wallace tell the story adequately from your friend's perspective?
Oh, that was a slightly different situation. The depressed person story is one that I have played every part in and feel like I constantly play every part in all the time, my whole
let's talk about that, because this is a whole lot more there's a whole lot more to discuss in The Depressed Person by David Foster Wallace from Harper's Magazine. I haven't played every role in this story. I have a lot of feelings about it as a story and would love to discuss what I think works and what doesn't. I would like to hear you introduce it to our listeners, and then we can have a spirited
Yes. Okay. So The Depressed Person is a short story. I suspect you would describe it as an 8-page story that feels like 30 pages or something.
It feels like 10,000 pages. Yeah, it feels. It was published probably 2 years after Infinite Jest, and feels longer than Infinite Jest. It never ends. Yeah. The Depressed Person, but it's only 8 pages.
Yeah, it is about a female depressed person who's never named except to be called the depressed person. Who I'll read the first couple sentences. Oh, I should say I believe I may have missed one, but I believe every single sentence in this story is notably a long sentence, and some are extremely long. But there's the usual rhythm where you break up long sentences with short sentences in order to give your reader some relief is sort of studiously avoided, and it's truly relentless.
Including all of the sentences in the multiple footnotes. I mean,
which at some point grow much larger than the print of the proper story on the page.
And again, there's no doubt that, especially after Infinite Jest, at this point in his career, all of this is very much by design. That nothing is. Oh yeah, it's not like where we talked about how Garth Greenwell wrote a first sentence that said, "I like long sentences," and we discussed if he purposely wrote a short. And the answer is he was probably just talking. It's clear that David Foster Wallace is making all these decisions very, very specifically and has absolute control over every brilliant and despicable aspect of this story.
Yes. So I'll just read the first 2 sentences, and then I'll try to sum up the basic, because there's not a straightforward plot, though there is a little bit of domino falling causality. The depressed person was in terrible and unceasing emotional pain, and the impossibility of sharing or articulating this pain was itself a component of the pain and a contributing factor in its essential horror. Despairing then of describing the emotional pain itself, the depressed person hoped at least to be able to express something of its context, its shape and texture, as it were, by recounting circumstances related to its etiology. You then get a brief summary of some of her childhood suffering with the hands of some divorcing and it sounds like relatively self-centered parents, though who knows how much more than normal. Most of the story is about the depressed person talking to her therapist about her friends or her friends about her therapist, and most of these conversations are dizzyingly multi-layered conversations in which she discussing the discussion and all of her feelings about all of the many periods of recursion in her obsessive perseverating thought, all about basically the terrible problem of wanting very much to talk to other people about her pain, but also both finding that addictive and necessary, but also no real relief, and feeling horrible guilt about doing that, and then resenting everybody for the guilt that she feels for knowing that she's making everybody have a terrible time. And
how does it end?
Oh, and the therapist ambiguously kills herself, and then it ends with the depressed person articulating at excruciating length a question to her very best friend, demanding in completely untempered terms everything that the friend thinks critically about the depressed person, and every way in which the depressed person has inflicted major or minor emotional and social and sororal pain on the friend. And then we kind of end with the articulation of that question.
So
I also would just quickly say, I have read the story many times. Every single time I read it, I laugh out loud throughout the entire story. I find I had to stop underlining because I find like half of the lines in this story truly hilariously laugh out loud funny.
All right, so you were just talking about how at the end she's talking to her best friend and asking how unbearable she, the depressed person, is. And we get this sentence. And this terrifying set of realizations, instead of awakening in her any sense of compassion, empathy, or other grief for the therapist, and here the depressed person waited patiently for an episode of retching in the especially available trusted friend to pass so that she could take the emotional risk of sharing this with her. These realizations seem merely to have brought up in the depressed person still more feelings about herself. So that sentence is funny because it's, as an aside, the fact that the depressed person's closest friend has all this time to listen to the depressed person talk about being depressed because she herself is dying of some sort of vicious horror cancer, and is retching during the conversations. The depressed person has to stop to let her friend keep on retching before she can continue taking the, quote, emotional risk of sharing, unquote, with this woman. So that's the sort of joke you like in this piece.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, and there are some that are like because there's another one where invalidating this compromise, the therapist, who by this time had less than a year to live, said that she felt. But I think there's another type of joke that is not so much a joke of contrast with real problems or contrast with real suffering, is a joke that I think of this as being a story of emotional, exquisite emotional slapstick. It's like watching somebody try to move a piano up a set of stairs and continually falling down in increasingly elaborate ways. So despite overwhelming feelings of reluctance on the part of the depressed person, the therapist had strongly supported her in taking the risk of sharing with members of her support system an important emotional realization she, i.e. the depressed person, had achieved during an inner child-focused experiential therapy retreat weekend, which the therapist had supported her in taking the risk of enrolling in and giving herself open-mindedly over to the experience of. I mean, it's every effort to solve any problem is immediately defeated, and then in a balletic complexity that just only gets more convoluted as the story goes on.
Right, and the convoluted nature is really obviously is the semiotic as well, where you talk to it's not told her to do it, but helped her brave herself to take the risk of being vulnerable enough to go, he
uses scrupulously correct grammar to grind out sentences with just tortured syntax throughout. So we end on a lot of prepositions very much by design. Yeah.
Right. And David Foster Wallace is funny like this because he, in the round of interviews that he either begrudgingly or pretended begrudgingly did after Infinite Jest, he always complains about how in his rapturous reviews, everybody loves the book so much because it's funny, but he doesn't find the book funny. He finds the book incredibly sad. And
Infinite Jest.
I feel like there's a lot going. There's that here also, where he is essentially doing shtick. He's writing joke after joke after joke, pretending it's not jokes, pretending it's for the sake of emotional weight and to demonstrate that sort of depression.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I found Infinite Jest to be an just amazing drag. Like it felt like if instead of doing like a 3 hour movie that had like 8 awesome disconnected scenes, you know, if Quentin Tarantino instead made a 1,000 hour movie that had 8 awesome
Sorry,
scenes.
hang on.
That's sorry. Yeah, like I think like Infinite Jest was like had lots of great parts, but it was so much bigger and more boring than its great parts that it was not a good book. This I just find to be a laugh riot, and I would be very surprised if he would sincerely claim that this was not like meant to be a funny story.
Really, even after he killed himself, you think he would claim that?
Oh, I mean, I think he wouldn't claim it after he killed himself because he probably wouldn't claim much of anything. But no, I think like what I read this as being like the very best slapstick. It is both hilariously in like it's a hilarious and exaggerated demonstration of an extremely truthful shortcoming and like physical incompetence and emotional incompetence.
But is it
I read it as being like a
exaggerated?
super. Oh, I think it's a super accurate. It's one of the few like very very accurate depictions of depression I think that I've found in literature that we feel really satisfying. I think it's a comic one, but it just feels like it really gets it very accurately conveys a certain sort of catch-22 that is involved in depression. I did
So
actually
Father,
did this literally this morning. I had an experience from this story with my dad. I wasn't telling him about how depressed I was, but I called him about travel scheduling, and 45 minutes later I was giving him an impromptu speech about how like dogs' willingness to eat other animals' shit is like directly and obviously linked evolutionarily to the like health effects of like human emotions. And I just heard him say, "Uh-huh. Yeah. Oh, someone's at the door." And he literally gave me the "someone's at the door" line and then hung up, which is directly out of the story. I was in the middle of reading the story when so yeah, I mean like I totally relate to all corners of this story and I just find it very funny. But I also
what
like
about the David Foster Wallace-ness of the story? So we discussed the story Incarnations of Burned Children in a previous episode.
yeah.
And in that story, David Foster Wallace gets out of his own way. And he has certain tics, and he has a mother and a father and long sentences and sort of some repetition. But even just to reread what you read, just the first sentence of the story, the depressed person was in terrible and unceasing emotional pain, and the impossibility of sharing or articulating this pain was itself a component of the pain and a contributing factor of its essential horror. So the three pains in the first sentence, followed by essential horror, is such a look at me sentence. And the same thing, the repetition of depressed person, depressed person, depressed person. The footnotes that grow and grow and grow. Anytime he's asked about footnotes, he talks about, the fractured reality. It means that he needs to fracture his prose, and the extent that he can do so, footnotes or endnotes are the best ways to do so. And then the vocabulary, I haven't read this type of David Foster Wallace for a while, where he puts in crazy words for no reason. And if there's a reason, let me hear it. But maxillofacial health, meaning having to do with his face and jaw or something, or teeth. Or there's another one later where she's looking at her therapist's office, and she writes, the therapist's chilly home office also contained, on the wall opposite the bronze clock and behind the therapist's recliner, a stunning molybdenum desk and personal computer hutch ensemble. Was that a word you knew?
No.
So I have to look it up. It means it's a lead-like element used in making some steel, like hard metal.
Sure, yeah.
But that's not a word used to describe furniture. So whose mind are we in any of this? Like, I don't get it. I don't know what he's doing. Like, if this is just a description of being depressed, then why does he step on his own toes so much? Why does he have to David Foster Wallace the whole thing up to this extent?
So the molybdenum I feel differently about than the maxillofacial.
But whose voice is maxillofacial?
Well, I think it's all in his voice, but it's like, I mean, I read him as narrating the story not even in a true close third, but almost in a like a 19th century omniscient close third. Like, I almost read him as like somebody who's able to observe her mind and is himself commenting on it.
But why does that help this story? Because the answer to my question, or the easiest answer, is why it helps the story, is she's not able to articulate any sense of self. So we need an outsider to tell her story in order to get to the core of her pain. Because if you have the dual theses of this story, it's one, it is impossible to make a reader feel, or make anyone feel, this sort of severity of depression and that pain. And then on top of that, this woman is not capable of making anybody understand anything about her own life. So that distances other people from her life even more from that pain. But the idea that David Foster Wallace needs to come in and David Foster Wallace tricks and language and footnotes, it just feels so dated to me in a way that I was surprised, and that great art tends not to. And I haven't read much of it lately, but in the same way that like reading Barth or Barthelme right now feels like, it's like a Barth or Barthelme thing, or like they're doing like the tricks that they do. Like I was so alienated from this story because of how Foster Wallacean it is. And you know, I was like a huge Dave Eggers guy growing up. I read everything he wrote until he started writing unimpeachably moral fiction. And I mean, nonfiction. I had trouble with that and I stopped reading it, but I still like his fiction. But you go back to a heartbreaking work of staggering genius, and it is so dated. It's almost readable, where it's so of the moment, where it's fascinating as a historical artifact more so than a work of literature. And I feel that way about this story, where like we know David Foster Wallace committed suicide, we know he was a depressive, we know he did all these David Foster Wallace things, and I can't get over it, just how actively he decides to filter all of this through what seemed to me to be an arbitrary cotillion of techniques and ways that he has decided to write. What's the argument against that?
I can't defend every choice of diction in the story, but I do think that this is a little bit like the right man for the task. I think he writes in a quintessentially David Foster Wallace-ish way, but I think it's just the right technique for the problem. That like one of the essential conflicts of this character is that she feels a need to explain what is going on, but she is at least in this sort of weird hybrid her/Wallace voice, the problem is not that she needs some insight from her friends, that she already has a truly exhaustive understanding of every aspect of this problem, and so she can't help but articulate this painfully thorough perspective, and it's his knack for articulating complexity in conversational, if performatively, complicated sentences, enacts really, I think, accurately and persuasively this problem for her. She can't help but. The depressed person found this fresh loss so shattering, its resultant hopelessness and despair so unbearable, that she was forced now to reach frantically and repeatedly out to her support system, calling 3 or even 4 different supportive friends in an evening, sometimes calling the same friend twice in one night, sometimes at a very late hour. And sometimes even the depressed person felt sickeningly sure, either waking them up or maybe interrupting them in the midst of healthy and joyful sexual intimacy with their partner. She can't help but already anticipate all of the different angles on this problem. And I definitely recognize like the weird double impulse to express a feeling like this while also saying like, let me just preempt any insight you might feel obliged or inclined to offer, because I've already thought of it and it won't help.
100%.
And that seems like his, and even the footnotes feel like an extension of that sort of unnecessary but inevitable complication.
I agree. The only place I disagree with what you're saying is that I think what he's demonstrating is how perceptive David Foster Wallace is on these moments of depression and this feeling, which is why I think Stephen Dixon is a greater writer than David Foster Wallace, because Stephen Dixon has written very similar stories to this, but he stays inside the mind of the depressive and he doesn't step out and do footnotes and polysyllabic crazy words that I have to look up, but he makes me live within the suffering, sad man. And at the end of it, I feel suffering and sad. I mean, the story Sleep comes to mind, especially where he writes a story about a man whose wife dies and how he can't fall asleep, and you're caught up in the mania of the repetition of him needing to sleep and him going through the life of his wife and going through his own life and being so tired, and it is an exhausting story, but you empathize with the character as opposed to here where you laugh at the character, and maybe there are moments of empathy here with the laughter, but I see this as David Foster Wallace flexing literary muscles, and more than literary muscles, like empathy muscles. Here, I see David Wallace saying, "Look how good I am at understanding this pain, a pain which is impossible to explain, but now I'm going to sort of demonstrate my tour de force in explaining it." Where I don't think that's necessary. I think this is him showing off more than him putting you in the mind of a depressed person, which is why I think, again, Stephen Dixon does something very, very similar with similar antecedents of Barthelme and Barth and Cheever in some ways, and other writers, but he and they both also have styles that are so uniquely their own, where you read 4 sentences by Stephen Dixon and 4 sentences by David Foster Wallace, you know immediately who wrote which of those sentences. But I just think that there's a cruelty to David Foster Wallace and a look at me bravado that Eggers has, and that Nicholson Baker has, and that Barth and Barthelme have, but that Dixon doesn't have, and that I think that the best writers don't have. Anyway, that's where I get pissed off at him, and I would love to hear your response to that, because this story pissed me off the more that I read it, as opposed to made me feel empathy.
You're hearing this crisis in the other room.
Do you find that when your kids are yelling, or when your wife is yelling at your kids, you are paralyzed in the way I do? I can't, if my kid is tantruming or being mean or something, I can't eat or literally piss. Like if I'm standing there trying to go to the bathroom and I can't start urinating or continue to urinate if I hear like my kids in a frenzy in that way. I find the connection so visceral that I am completely paralyzed by their emotional reality.
You're talking about like in situations where you're not, where like it's there, there's a reason you're not intervening. Like if sort of somebody else has it in hand, but you're hearing it.
Either if somebody else has it in hand and I'm hearing it, or if I'm deciding not to intervene because I want to ignore Sam when he's tantruming.
Right. Yeah.
Either of those cases, I find myself physically unable to eat or relax my shoulders or urinate. Like I
don't think I feel that. I am very sensitive to noises and yelling and stomping and in like even whining or like that makes it impossible for me to think a thought, but I don't think I feel that same kind of, like, to the extent to which I could still think and do something. I don't have that hard a time breaking off from that, unless like the question is like, well, I need to go jump in.
Yeah, no, I envy that. There were moments when Owen was a year and a half, 2 years old before Sam was born, where he would be crying in a stroller, and I would be physically incapable of making a decision, or where to go with the stroller, or like whether to take him out, and Alex would get frustrated with me. She'd be just like, do the thing, and I couldn't. I physically couldn't. It's something I've never really felt like that, other than specifically with kids when they're out of control. But I somatically attached or something to their emotional reality. It's fucking weird.
Yeah. I do feel that link, and it'll come up with like physical, so like my my daughter's got like a weird, or had a weird reaction to some bug bites, like it's just like agonizing. But yeah, I don't think it's a little bit different. Yeah, all I was going to say is, I mean, everything you're saying makes sense to me, and I haven't read hardly any Dixon, and so I totally believe that he's written a story that does this same thing better. I have not read anything else that does quite what this does, and I do think that apart from the immersion in a depressed person's perspective, what I appreciate about this story is that it is specifically about, I mean, as the first sentence suggests, it's not about depression in total. It's about talking about it, and talking about it. That's the particular wrinkle and trap of this story. I think, like, though, just at an initial read, I find it very funny, but I also find it deeply like empathetic. Like, I totally empathize with the central character, as well as with all of her friends and her therapist. And I read it as, like, I think it's a female depressed person only because that was a way for him to make it not seem so embarrassingly obviously autobiographical. Like,
Yeah,
I
agree
read
with
this, I
that.
assume this is him. I mean,
So do I. I and that cruelty towards himself and towards his friends and towards the psychologist, it are all just sort of natural and honest
it just seems like an
explanations of the
accurate.
cruelty that he feels
Yeah.
towards himself and everybody. And then, is that where I mean, I don't know how you're supposed to rate him from his work any more than you are, Woody Allen's,
Right.
or anybody else's. But, like, is that an explanation for why he threw a coffee table at Mary Carr and tried to push her out of a moving car and stuff? Like
Oh, I
it's
don't,
just hard. It's so
I
hard for
can't.
me to
Yeah.
see this sort of cruelty in this towards every, like, he's making fun of all of these characters. And
Yeah, but in a way
I
that feels
guess
so right. Like, it feels so true to the experience of being all these characters.
that they
He,
all deserve to be mocked, or that they all have that
well, like,
mockery
it's
in them.
that it's not only that they can be mocked, or they have that mockery in them, but, like, it would be inaccurate not to mock them. Like, there's a Baudelaire short thing, prose poem, short story that I love, in which an old woman talks about how, now that she's old and decrepit, she can see that everybody finds it painful to look at her and be around her. And it's really, really relentless. And she, like, it ends with, like, the beautiful baby that's her granddaughter that she just wants to hold and is so thrilled to see, looks at her in horror and cries. And it's so punishing, but it, like, the way I read it, it's like it would be more cruel to pretend that there was not some truth to this. Like, not that everybody actually has that total response to her, but, like, that feeling that everybody has that response is a genuine part of her experience. I kind of wonder if there were a story about a I mean, I don't want to, like, get weirdly personal, but, like, if there were a story about a dizzy guy that, like, part of the story was making fun of, like, the inevitable confusion and humiliation and, like, frustration of being dizzy in a way that was also funny, I could imagine my finding that kind of painful and shitty in a way that for you it might strike a nerve and think, like, oh God, this really gets it.
That's interesting. So you think that because you're more of a depressive than I am, you
I
are
just so much relate to
allowing,
every
right?
sentence of
You
this story.
relate to
Like,
all of
every
it.
sentence feels
But
like,
what
oh God,
about
this is so right.
but what about that the name of that metal that is lead? Like,
Yeah, that feels like
why
an
why is that
unnecessary. Yeah,
there?
I
And,
don't
like
think
like
that's a
the
necessary
adjective
choice.
apian, which I didn't look up, but I assume it means bee
Be
like,
like,
because an
yeah,
apiary is where bees
yeah,
are,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So we sat there listening to the depressed person, always sat there listening to the empty apian drone of the dial
Yeah,
tone. I mean, that sentence would definitely be better without the word apian. One, because the dial tone doesn't really sound bee like, and
right.
empty drone of a dial tone
Is already
works on
telling
its
you, yeah,
own. So
yeah,
I don't get what that is. Like, I don't, these are
uh,
such aggressive
yeah,
decisions, that I don't
right,
know why he did that.
yeah. I mean,
And then that pisses me off, and it starts making me look for more, which is why then I go to
right,
the end notes, and thinking, like, well, part of the power of this is, I mean, and an explanation of the endnotes can just be David Foster Wallace wrote with footnotes and endnotes, so why am I picking on it here? But he doesn't always. He doesn't in Incarnation of Burned Children, which is more powerful than this.
But I also think they make a kind of sense here. Like this is also the way that the thought, like the pattern of thought of the whole story has been full of these parentheticals and full of these, like, you know, like there's a moment where the depressed person holds up her hand, which of course he has to describe as being like particularly gross because she chews her nails. She holds it up to silence her therapist so she can explain further that she's already thought of the thing the therapist is going to say. And to me, like, that's the microcosm of the whole fucking story, and that's including the footnotes. Right. I read the sesquipedalian vocabulary, to use another unnecessarily long word, as being, it doesn't rub me the wrong way. I don't think I think you're right that you could probably do without it and it might be better, but I read it as being kind of part of the same impulse to over articulate and over explain. So it doesn't bother me, but I also wouldn't necessarily feel like I need to defend it. I think, like, yeah, you could cut that and that would be fine.
What about the story ending with a question that's not answered? Because I feel like the place that the story builds most traditional momentum is on the last page, where she asks her closest friend, who she knows she can trust to give a true answer, the question that she feels most difficult to ask, which is that, like, please be honest, I'm unbearable, right? I'm as unbearable as I think I am. And we as a reader know that she is as unbearable as she thinks she is. And we know that the friend knows that she is as unbearable as she thinks she is. And it really is a moment of tension, whether the friend is going to tell her or not.
Yeah.
But Foster Wallace, I think I haven't read all of his work clearly, but what is relatively typical of him, he doesn't give us the satisfaction one way or the other of an answer.
Sure.
The story just ends before then. Does that feel suitable to the interminable nature of depression to you, and therefore the inevitable only way it could end, or as a cop-out?
Oh, no. I mean, I think, like, there's, in a way, it reads to me a lot like the end of The Sopranos, where famously,
exactly,
Tony looks up at a moment where arguably that you might think that, you know, the screen goes black suddenly mid song, mid scene, and you might very easily assume that he's just been murdered, or he could not be murdered. But in a way, like, even though of course that makes all the difference in the world in that moment, it sort of doesn't matter in our larger vision of him as a character. Because, like, in the same way, like, maybe this is a moment where a friend will come really clean with her, but it's not like that's finally going to change her pattern of thought. And maybe her friend will say what we sort of assume she has been saying all along, which is a, like, well-intended sort of white lie about how, well, I just really worry about you and want you to take good care of yourself, and I care, you know. So I think, like, in a way, there's all the difference in the world between those two outcomes, but it sort of doesn't matter which one. And I also think, like, if you're asking, like, she asks for how was she to decide and describe, even to herself, facing herself, what all she had learned said about her, and, like, sort of that articulation is the whole story. Like, we get part of the thrust of the story is to give us a sort of scrupulous articulation of exactly how annoying depressed people are when talking, as well as how much they know that, and the problem, and, like, the need to talk about it while also knowing that it sucks to hear people talk about it is itself a part of the pain. Like, that seems to me like, it seems like the story sort of answers the question, so you don't really need the friend to.
Are you surprised that they always pick up in the story? That there's not
pick up the phone?
Yeah, that there's not a digression where people aren't picking up the phone. I kept on expecting that, and then her to imagine that they're all talking to one another about it. And it's funny how reliable David Foster Wallace makes this group of friends, that they are always there to be whined at by her.
I think, like, probably more accurately, they would pick up the phone not as often. Yeah. I think like probably more realistically, there would be some unanswered phone calls. I think partly it's a demonstration of, like, let's give her an amazingly, incredibly generous set of friends. Like, let's give her a really robust support system, and they're always willing to let her talk at length, and they're always reassure her that she's not annoying, and see how that's still hell. I think is kind of the challenge. Whereas like, yeah, like a depressed person who's increasingly cut off from people, like, yeah, we know that sucks and we kind of don't need to have it demonstrated to us, I guess.
Have you read works that seem that depict depression in a successful way as this one does? I mean,
Yeah.
would you count what's the Camus where his mom dies?
The Stranger.
Yeah, with
I have read
that.
The Stranger, and I mean, I probably need to reread it. I never responded much to that book.
Yeah.
I think it's a little brief moment, but I've written about it elsewhere. But I think there's a little brief moment in the end of the affair uh,
Hmm.
where the narrator refers to like that black ailment, and he just like basically he loses a day, or he loses like several days, and he just sort of like refers to it obliquely, but it feels very true the way he does that. I think like the biggest artistic rendering of depression that I've seen that felt really true is the movie Melancholia,
Hmm.
which I also know, like, as with this, like, this was straight, like, I recommended this to Alice, and I think her response was like, huh, uh, and then she brought up a different thing we could talk about instead. And I think like that's
So
like
I
a lot
was
of
I
people.
was choice B as someone to discuss the story with you.
I think like I
You
am
went to
reminded of
Alice
a lot
instead.
because it's so funny, and so I was reminded of it when I was reading something for her, and then I was reminded of it again reading something for you, and you were the sucker who said yes. Uh,
Got it.
yeah, but like Melancholia, similarly, I'll recommend it to people, and they're like, I fucking hated that movie. That movie was so painful to watch. Yeah, but like I think that's yeah.
And the sun also rises sort of has a good depressed person in
Yeah,
it
it
as
does.
a
It feels more like it feels different in a way just because there's such an obvious and specific event and
reason
wound, and
why,
yeah,
right?
like um
Invisible, which we've talked about in the past, that
Invisible what?
the Invisible Man is not
Oh,
the just regular Invisible Man, right? There's
yeah,
nobody.
Invisible Man. Yeah, I mean, I that story, that whole book is just such a extra, like it's one of those books that's like a tornado that just like picks up all of America.
Right, right,
Yeah,
right.
I mean, I don't. The specific depression in it doesn't necessarily stand out. You know, weirdly, it's a very flawed novel, but I do have a vague
The Body
recollection.
Politic by Brian Platzer. Was that what you're gonna? It's never really spoken to me, but
It's a very flawed novel. I can't identify
but
any virtues. I don't remember why I brought it up, but no, I was going to say I feel it's been like probably like 28 years since I read it, but I do feel I have like a vague memory of thinking that Giovanni's Room had a pretty accurate depiction of depression. I don't. I
well,
would need
yeah,
to
that's. I mean, it both from Giovanni and the narrator. I guess
yeah,
they're going
that
through
feels
simultaneous
true. Yeah.
depressions together, and they're stuck in that small room. That's
Yeah,
pretty
yeah.
good. That's a good one.
I really wish that book had just gotten like a better line edit. I just felt like there are a lot of lines that were like, this could have been tightened.
I love that book. That's one of my favorite
Yeah.
books. If,
Oh,
if
yeah,
you
yeah,
catch me in the right mood, I'll tell you
yeah,
that it's my favorite book. There's something very like juvenile about the book.
yeah, yeah.
There's something very like
It's like it feels like very much like
full of
a
itself and
young man's
maximalist and
novel.
like a
Yeah,
young. But there's something about the language that's so flailing that I don't know, that works to describe that
yeah.
fear and loneliness and coming to terms with his sexuality and all of that
Yeah.
I think works.
And
I wouldn't
you
want it
lived in
line
Paris
edited
for a little bit, right?
at that age as a
Yeah,
lonely
right.
sad
So yeah,
man.
I
Yeah,
can see that.
which
Yeah, that makes
definitely.
perfect. Yeah, no, I mean it's definitely like there's a reason that's stuck with me. Like it's not something to be sneezed at. Oh, and then I think like the other two that maybe leap out is like there is a passage in All the King's Men where the narrator has a kind of a crisis and drives to California, and that felt like
I don't remember
I just
that.
felt I recognized it, and then though it's a different kind of it's like a folie à deux depression. I'm mispronouncing it, I'm sure, but like a certain kind of marital misery and that's like that
Right.
feels linked to depression is Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I think that
For
feels like
sure. Right. That's
like
seeped
that
in that
gets something
same.
really right about that.
Right. And I guess
Um,
all of Jesus's son is similarly
I've only seen
successful
the
in
movie.
demonstrating that.
I've heard the book is wonderful.
Really?
Yeah, I need to.
Really?
I just
Oh,
saw it in
it's
the
I
movie
mean,
theater when I was in high school, but yeah, I've heard.
yeah,
I
yeah, you should read that. You gotta go.
I need to go. Yeah,
All right.
yeah, I gotta go. But
Pleasure as
more,
always.
yeah, more soon. That was my conversation with Brian about My Life in Fantasy Sports / Can Men Be Friends by Zach Cheney Rice, as well as The Depressed Person by David Foster Wallace. I'm probably going to have abbreviated show notes this week because it's already Wednesday, and as I said, been a long couple of weeks at this point. So here, though, is a short poem I've been wanting to share with you. That this is one that is unusual in that I actually received this one in the slush pile for the magazine, which I don't usually name, but for the sake of offering a link to this week's episode, I will name here. It's Literary Matters. It's the online publication of the ALSCW. This is a poem by Maury Creech. I have met Maury a couple times a long while ago, and when he sent in this submission, I'd already reviewed one of his books, and I was actually working on a long piece, kind of an overview of his career. He is I think he's a really excellent living poet who is far less known and celebrated than he should be. He also, it is no secret that slush piles are not at all egalitarian, and that there is a lot of favor trading and name dropping and card pulling and so forth involved in the process. And typically for a writer who knows an editor personally, or certainly one who has enough of a reputation or name, as Maury does. I mean, Maury, whose third book was shortlisted for the Pulitzer in a short list of 2 or maybe 3. Typically, poets in that position will write directly to the editor rather than bothering with a slush pile. And I would have completely been delighted. I wouldn't have batted an eye, and I would in fact simply have been pleased if Maury had reached out in that way. Not only did he not do that, he paid the submission fee. I mean, there's a long history to the submission fee for Literary Matters that I'm not going to get into, but we're hoping to change it in the near future. And Maury paid I'll just say this. He went out of his way to be not just not a big dog, but incredibly humble and considerate and sweet and unassuming, and just sent in this packet of pretty amazing poems. One of which is, I think we took a few of them, but the one that really stuck in my mind was called "Giving Myself Up." This is not a poem of Cameron's mad prisms of language. It's an extremely plain-spoken poem, but it's one I have not been able to stop thinking about since I read it. So I'll put a link in the show notes. This is "Giving Myself Up" by Maury Creech. I am tired of having a name. Every time I wake, it grinds its teeth like the gears of a moving van, and it smells of soot, like the sweat of being a man, and it weighs like a stone I carry for no one's sake. In the courthouse, it echoes down the long corridors, and it creaks in the bed springs of cheap rooms, and it croons in bars. It whistles up to the gaps between the stars, and down to the truck stop bathroom's piss-stained floors. I have betrayed it to the dark, when there was no one to blame, and whispered it seductively into the ear of danger. But I am tired, and I want to be done with it for good. I will give it up. I will answer to nothing. I will be a stranger. I will put on the silence like an executioner's hood. Here it is, poor neck, squirming on the block. My name. I don't want to over-explain this poem because I think it so effectively represents itself. This is a poem that, as John Gardner might say, teachers would shy away from teaching because it doesn't need them to explain it. It doesn't need to be presented or glossed. It's simply, it gets the job done perfectly well without them. A couple of thoughts, though. It is a sonnet. It's an unconventional sonnet with not a rhyme scheme I recognize. Oh, is he doing just the simple thing I do? Yeah, he is. I'm a fucking idiot. So this is a sonnet, and he has simply broken the lines roughly in half. Yeah. I was thrown by quarters and floors. So what is it? What is he doing here? So A, B, B. Oh, it's A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A. What? I'm a fucking idiot. I'm sorry. So blame, danger, good, B, hood, name. Dangerous train. Yeah, there's something a little wrinkly is happening in this and the extended sestet, but at any rate, he's, it's something I've talked about before. It is not a poem that announces itself as rhyming, though if you can't hear the rhymes, then you're probably hard of hearing, or at least harder of hearing than I am. The two obvious antecedents to this poem, by my lights, are Anonymous by Everett Maddox and Tired by Fenton Johnson, which I read on a very early episode of this podcast. He even includes the line, I am tired. But both of those poems are poems in which the speaker sort of enumerates all of the elements of his life that he is eager to be rid of. Here, those elements are summed up by the speaker's name. I think this is a poem. I have a real soft spot for elemental poems in which the pieces used, the images, the words used are relatively fundamental. They don't require a great deal of elaboration. I think of them almost as like to piss off all the scientists and mathematicians in the audience, a limited number to be sure. I think of something like noble gases or primary numbers, these elements that can't be further reduced, that are sort of rounded off and complete in themselves, and for that reason very difficult to use in a way that feels new, that still draws blood. And here he manages to, in the extremely vivid closing image, I will put on the silence like an executioner's hood, right? The silence is the tenor and the executioner's hood is a vehicle. But then in the next sentence, that execution, which was simply evoked by the simile before, is now literal. Here it is, poor neck. And here's one of the most effective words in the poem, squirming on the block, my name. Here it is, poor neck, lying on the block, my name. Far, far weaker ending. Squirming gives us just that resistance, that little bit of live fear, discomfort, physical presence that really, really sells that closing image of the chopping block for the speaker's name. So that's all I'm going to say about it, because again, I think the poem speaks for itself far better than I could. I'm just going to read it one more time and then sign off. This is Giving Myself Up by Maury Creech. I am tired of having a name. Every time I wake, it grinds its teeth like the gears of a moving van, and it smells of soot like the sweat of being a man. And it weighs like a stone I carry for no one's sake. In the courthouse, it echoes down the long corridors, and it creaks in the bed springs of cheap rooms, and it croons in bars. It whistles up to the gaps between the stars, and down to the truck stop bathroom's piss-stained floors. I have betrayed it to the dark, when there was no one to blame, and whispered it seductively into the ear of danger. But I am tired, and I want to be done with it for good. I will give it up. I will answer to nothing. I will be a stranger. I will put on the silence like an executioner's hood. Here it is, poor neck, squirming on the block. My name. That was Giving Myself Up by Maury Creech, and this is Slee Ricketts. Thank you all so much for listening. You can reach me, as always, at sleericketts@gmail.com, especially you Big Five poetry book editors writing in with your furious refutations of my casual dismissal. I cannot wait to read your grammatically erroneous emails. Filled with subject verb agreement errors. You fucking hacks. All right. That's all. Fuck. I'm never going to put out a book with a Big Five publisher now. With any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.